You stand in a doorway watching torchlight paint shadows across marble. The dress they've chosen for you weighs like armor, but you know it offers no protection. Behind you, women whisper some you recognize from noble houses. Others you've never seen, their eyes carrying the same trapped animal look you feel crawling up your spine. Ahead, through the archway, you hear laughter that doesn't sound like joy. Someone is counting. You don't know what they're counting or why, but the numbers rise 1, 2, 3, and each one lands like a fist in your chest. You were told this was a wedding celebration. You were told to smile, to obey, to remember that your family's survival depends on tonight. What you weren't told is that by morning, you'll understand exactly how far power can reach when it decides shame is a political tool. If you're drawn to these buried histories, leave a comment. I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're watching from, because stories like this one shouldn't be forgotten, no matter how dark they get. The woman in the doorway existed. Her name, like so many others that night, was erased by men who kept meticulous records of everything except the humanity of their victims. The place was Vatican City, the Apostolic Palace, rooms normally reserved for prayer and diplomacy. The date was January 1502. Though some sources place it weeks earlier, the archives are maddeningly vague on timing, precise only about what happened. The architect of the evening was Rodrigo Borgia, who wore 2 crowns that night: Pope Alexander VI, spiritual leader of Christendom, and patriarch of a family that had turned papal authority into a weapon. His daughter, Lucretia Borgia, 21 years old, and married twice before, was the bride. Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, was the groom who didn't want to be there. And the event that would scar all of them was designed not as celebration, but as demonstration. A calculated display meant to teach Rome's elite exactly what happened when you forgot who held the power. The marriage itself was a transaction dressed in sacrament. Alfonso's father, Ercole d'Este, had weighed the risks, refuse the Borgias, and face a papal army. Accept and tie Ferrara's fortunes to the most dangerous family in Italy. He chose survival. Alfonso, educated in statecraft and warfare, understood the arithmetic. He rode to Rome with a retinue that was quietly detained, their movements restricted, their letters read. By the time he stood at the altar with Lucretia, he was less a groom than a hostage in ceremonial dress. She, for her part, had learned through 2 previous marriages that her body was currency in her father's political bank. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had been discarded when the alliance no longer served Borgia interests, the marriage annulled. On grounds of impotence, a public humiliation that served as warning. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had been murdered, likely on orders from her brother, Cesar, when his family became inconvenient. Now she stood beside another Alfonso, and if she felt anything beyond resignation, the records don't capture it. The wedding ceremony followed protocol. Latin prayers echoed off frescoed ceilings, cardinals in scarlet processed with candles. Alexander VI himself officiated, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority that stretched back centuries. 2 witnesses from foreign courts, Venetian ambassadors, Florentine envoys, representatives from France and Spain. The scene appeared legitimate, even lavish. What they couldn't see yet was the architecture of control being assembled in adjacent rooms. Servants had been briefed. Guards positioned, certain women courtesans, yes, but also women from noble houses who couldn't refuse a papal summons, had been gathered and given instructions that turned their stomachs. The Vatican, that fortress of spiritual power, had become a stage where humiliation would be performed as policy. The banquet began, ordinarily enough, tables bent under the weight of roasted game, imported fruits, wine from estates the Borgias had seized or purchased. Music played lutes and viols, creating the soundtrack for what appeared to be celebration. Alfonso sat stiffly, Lucretia beside him, both performing the gestures expected of newlyweds while their eyes telegraphed different stories. Around them, cardinals and nobles made conversation, political calculations disguised as pleasantries. Then the tone shifted. Doors opened that shouldn't have. Women entered, some partially clothed, others not at all, and the room's oxygen seemed to vanish. What happened next was recorded by Johannes Burchard, the German master of ceremonies whose diary entries mix bureaucratic precision with moral horror. 50 courtesans, he wrote, were brought into the papal apartments. They danced, first clothed, then not. Then they were instructed to crawl on hands and knees across the floor, gathering chestnuts that had been scattered across marble, while men, cardinals, bishops, the Pope himself, watched and wagered on which woman would collect the most. The scene was designed to degrade, not just the women, though they bore the immediate violence, but everyone present. To force Rome's elite to witness this spectacle in sacred space was to prove that no boundary liturgical, moral, social, meant anything when the Borgias decided otherwise. Some cardinals lowered their eyes, others laughed, the sound hollow and performed, because silence in that room was its own kind of danger. Alfonso sat frozen, understanding with each passing minute that the humiliation wasn't finished, that the night had only begun its work. Lucretia's reaction isn't recorded in detail, but one observer noted her hands trembling, her gaze fixed on the table as if she could will herself into invisibility. The chestnuts were just preparation. What the sources describe next, and here we must rely on Burchard's account, corroborated by diplomatic letters sent in horrified whispers across Europe, was the deliberate public consummation of the marriage, not once, but 3 times. In view of witnesses who had been stationed not for celebration, but for verification, the legal logic was surgical. A marriage could be annulled if not consummated. Public proof eliminated that possibility. But the execution of that logic was violence. Alfonso was ordered to perform. Lucretia, surrounded by her father's guards and her brother's enforcers, had no avenue for refusal. Between each act, Cesare Borgia soldier, cardinal's son, the family's enforcer entered the chamber to inspect the bed, to confirm, to announce to the assembled witnesses that the deed was done and legal challenges were now impossible. Think about what that room contained. A bride who had watched 2 previous husbands destroyed by her family's ambitions. A groom who had ridden to Rome knowing refusal meant war, but compliance meant this. Guards whose job was to ensure neither party fled, and witnesses, clergy, nobles, diplomats, whose presence converted intimacy into spectacle, whose eyes turned a bedroom into a courtroom where bodies provided evidence. The psychological architecture of that night was as deliberate as the physical, every element designed to strip autonomy, to prove that privacy was a privilege the powerful could revoke, and to create complicity among witnesses who would carry the memory but rarely speak it. The number 3 mattered. Once could be duty. Twice could be enthusiasm. 3 times was domination, a methodical demonstration that the Borgias controlled not just political outcomes but the most intimate human acts. Between consummations, hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and trauma. The sources note that Alfonso grew pale, that his movements became mechanical. Lucretia's silence deepened, and through it all, the papal apartments rooms where popes had signed treaties and composed encyclicals served as the stage for a family showing. Rome exactly what papal authority looked like when divorced from moral constraint. The aftermath rippled outward in waves. Within days, diplomatic dispatches carried the story across Europe, each court interpreting the scandal through its own political lens. Venice, always suspicious of papal power, used the episode as evidence of Borgia depravity. Florence, navigating alliances carefully, recorded the events with strategic ambiguity. The French court, allied with the Borgias, downplayed the accounts as enemy propaganda. But the consistency across hostile sources suggests something undeniable happened. Chroniclers who agreed on little else confirmed the broad strokes. A wedding night turned into public theater. Intimacy converted into political weapon. Bodies used as instruments of state power. For Lucretia, departure to Ferrara came as escape and exile both. In Alfonso's ancestral home, she would spend the next 2 decades rebuilding something like dignity. She patronized artists commissioning works from the era's finest painters, supporting poets and musicians who sang her praises in carefully constructed verse. She administered the duchy with competence. When Alfonso was away, managed vast estates, oversaw charitable foundations. Contemporary accounts from Ferrara describe a woman of intelligence and piety, far from the scandalous figure Roman gossip had created. But they also note her withdrawal, her preference for private chapels over public ceremony, her reluctance to discuss her Roman years. She bore several children, securing the EST line, fulfilling the dynastic purpose that had justified everything, but observers noted the distance between her and Alfonso, a marriage that functioned politically but remained emotionally hollow. Alfonso himself carried the night differently. He ruled Ferrara with military precision, defending borders and managing alliances. But something in him had been damaged. Courtiers reported his reluctance to speak of Rome, his coldness toward papal envoys, his careful neutrality in later conflicts involving the Borgias. When Cesare Borgia's power collapsed after Alexander VI's death in 1503, the Pope dying suddenly, possibly poisoned his son, losing papal protection, and eventually dying in obscure battle, Alfonso showed no interest in capitalizing on their misfortune. The calculus that had sent him to Rome in 1502 had been proven correct. He survived, his family endured. But survival came at a cost, measured in sleepless nights and a marriage that felt more like shared imprisonment than partnership. The institutional damage metastasized slowly. Protestant reformers, gathering evidence for their arguments against Rome, would later cite Borgia excesses as proof that the papacy had become a vehicle for worldly ambition rather than spiritual leadership. Martin Luther's critiques of papal corruption drew on a catalog of abuses, and while Lucretia's wedding night wasn't the central charge, it fed the narrative. Sacred office perverted, holy spaces defiled, bodies commodified in the name of dynastic politics. Catholic reformers within the Church also used the Borgia era as cautionary tale, arguing for cleansing institutions that had allowed such transgressions. The Council of Trent, convened decades later to address corruption, operated in the shadow of scandals like this one, specific abuses that demanded systemic response. But perhaps the deepest damage was to the people in that room who weren't Borgias. The cardinals, who witnessed and stayed silent, their moral authority corroded by complicity. The courtesans forced to perform, some of whom appear in later records as broken women dependent on church charity, their reputations destroyed by a night they couldn't refuse. The guards and servants who enabled the machinery of humiliation, who learned that their employment depended on surrendering conscience, and the women from noble houses, unnamed in chronicles, who returned to families that chose silence over confrontation, who carried the memory of that evening like an unhealed wound. Their stories were suppressed, not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much. Acknowledgement would require accountability, and the families who ran Rome preferred amnesia. Lucretia died in 1519, at 39, from complications of childbirth. Her last hours, according to sympathetic chroniclers, were spent in prayer, seeking spiritual solace for a life that had been shaped by forces beyond her control. Whether those prayers brought peace is unknowable. What's certain is that her public reputation, stained by scandals both real and invented, never fully recovered. Later centuries would argue over her. Was she victim or accomplice, pawn or player? The question itself misses the point. She was both and neither, a woman whose agency existed only in the narrow spaces her family's ambitions allowed. The wedding night of 1502 defined her not because of anything she chose, but because her father and brother chose to use her marriage as demonstration project in the mechanics of power. The Vatican, that vast accumulation of stone and sanctity, kept its secrets with architectural efficiency. The apartments where the banquet occurred were redecorated, repurposed, their history gradually obscured by new frescoes and new scandals. But the memory persisted in whispers, in diplomatic correspondence filed away in foreign archives. In the diary of Johannes Burchard, that would eventually surface to horrify later historians, the building couldn't forget even when its occupants tried to. Stone remembers what flesh would rather erase, and in the end, that's what makes this story more than scandal. It's evidence of a simple, terrible truth. When institutions concentrate power without accountability, when authority answers only to itself, the most intimate human spaces become vulnerable to invasion. The wedding night becomes political theater. The marriage bed becomes courtroom. Bodies become evidence in arguments about legitimacy and control. And the people inside those bodies, Lucretia with her forced smile, Alfonso with his trapped compliance. The unnamed women gathering chestnuts on cold marble learned that dignity is not a right, but a privilege, granted or revoked by those who hold the keys to the palace doors, 3 times in one night. While everyone watched, not because anyone wanted to, but because power, when it decides to teach a lesson, ensures the classroom is full and the memory is permanent.